Amen.
Just makes you want to be outside. And I remember when I used to travel a lot with the air crew, there were a lot of times we'd have 3 or 4 days between all of our flights, and we'd have a lot of time to kill. And on beautiful days like this, we always had to do something outside. Like we didn't invent games. Over in the deserts in the Middle East, we'd invent frisbee golf and have these courses all over the sand to play. But one of our favorite pastimes when we had a couple of air crews was to play baseball. We'd play one team or one crew against the other. That first game, I always gave it my all. I'd be out there playing on the field, chasing every grounder, everything that I could. And then we'd barbecue a bunch of burgers and dogs, and then we'd start a second game. But, you know, in that second game, the sun was a little higher, it was a little hotter. I've had too many burgers and dogs. And by the 8th inning, I was usually to the point where I really just didn't care who was winning or losing. I just wanted to finish the game. My heart just wasn't in it. I was drained, and I just lost interest and didn't want to be out there anymore. We often hear that when we're watching sports. A team is losing because the sports commentator says their heart just wasn't in the game. Now, I don't think you can limit that attitude to just sports. I mean, how many times have you guys had coworkers that just didn't have their heart in the work? And they're the people that just come in and do the bare minimums. All they do is just what they have to do so that they don't get fired. Well, they're certainly not the people that you want training anybody. And they're certainly not the people that you want taking care of you when you're sick. But that happens too. You know, I hear stories about some of the hospital employees that just sit, and when somebody's in one of the rooms calling out for help, and when they're poked, they say, well, that's not one of mine, and they don't bother getting up. They have to be ordered to go into the room to take care of someone. And, you know, that's just outright scary. That could be life or death. And for them to have that attitude of, it's not my job, just isn't right. Well, I know that that attitude is few and far between with our caring professionals. But you see, now that Karen's a nurse, I've got other material aside from just Harleys and airplanes to give sermons about. But do you think that a minister ever loses heart? Do you think that that ever happens? Do you think it's possible? Well, I came across this article in the Philadelphia Free Thought Examiner. And the article was about the Danette LaSorsa report from the Center of Cognitive Studies from Tufts University. Well, Danette and LaSorsa had gone out and interviewed a bunch of ministers who are actually closet atheists. And in the study, they said that the people had, over a long period of time, began to lose their faith to the point where they just lost all belief. And these were priests in the study who had had this happen over a number of years. And part of the article said, why don't they resign their posts and find a new life? Why are they caught in a trap cunningly designed to harness both their best of intentions and their basest of fears to task immobilizing them in their predicament? Their salaries are modest and economic incentive to stay, to hang on by their fingernails and wait for retirement so they can get their pensions. I think I'm doing it because of financially I don't have a choice. I could quit and go in there today and say, today I'm not coming back. But that would be a huge financial burden on me. I mean, how would I continue to make my house payment and support my family, says one. It raises ethical questions. Should they continue to preach? Are they hypocrites? Or are they just men and women who have been caught in untenable positions, working at a job that's contrary to their ethics and morals, preaching to people who trust them about the stories of religion they themselves cannot accept? Can you believe that last line? I have to say that again. Are they hypocrites, or are they just men and women who have been caught in untenable positions, working in a job contrary to their ethics or morals? My gosh, this isn't just a job. It's not 9 to 5 where a boss tells you to do something you don't agree with. In most jobs, unless it's illegal, immoral, or just outright dangerous, if your boss tells you to do something, you usually hold your nose and do it. But they talk about this so nonchalantly. I mean, think about the uproar that there would be if you found out that, or if they found out that a climatologist from one side of the global warming debate or the other had a sudden change of heart And they realized that if they were on CNBC or Fox, that they really felt that they should be compelled to go to one of the other networks. My gosh, could you imagine if you found out your kid's doctor didn't believe in medications? Do you think you would even give the medications if they needed them? Would you send your kids to a teacher that believed that the earth was flat or that the moon landings were fake? Clergy, like doctors, are called to heal the broken. Doctors and nurses heal the broken body. Clergy heal the broken soul. I think it's more dangerous than having a doctor that's bad, because your body is finite, but your soul is eternal. But priesthood isn't just a job, it's a calling. This isn't something you do as a job, even though you don't agree with it. And even the scriptures tell us this. I'd like to read to you from verse 5. He commanded that there shall be no priestcrafts. For behold, priestcrafts are the men set themselves up for the light unto the world, that they may gain in the praise of the world, but they seek not for the welfare of Zion. Behold, the Lord hath forbidden such a thing. Wherefore the Lord hath given a commandment, that all men shall have charity, and that charity is love. And except that they shall have charity, they were nothing. Wherefore, if they have charity, that they would not suffer the labor in Zion to perish. But labor in Zion shall labor for Zion, for labor for money. For if they labor for money, they shall perish. Being a minister isn't just a job. It's a calling. It's a calling to care for the soul the way a doctor or a nurse cares for the body. We teach, we grow, we nurse broken spirits. To do it without belief for just money is a sin. To do it without belief and for just money means damnation. It's a calling of God that must be written on your heart. Well, after I read all that and read about priests who lost their faith, I began to wonder a bit, do atheists ever lose their faith in naturalism and humanism? What would happen to make an atheist change their heart? And I began to do a lot of digging and find articles about atheists who had a change of heart and what had happened to them. And what I found out is there's actually a large number of previous atheists who are now ministers in churches. And in the clergy and the Danette Lasorso report, it talked about how the ministers had a slow loss of faith over time. But contrarily, the atheists had an instantaneous change where something happened in their lives and they realized that there was a master of the universe. Well, we've all heard the story about the sudden conversion of William Murray. If you don't remember, he was the son of Madeline Murray O'Hare. She was the atheist that prodded her son to go before the Supreme Court and argue that we get prayer out of schools here in Texas. Well, he had a conversion where he had a nightmarish vision that was interrupted by an angel. In an instant, his conversion was a flash. Well, there are a number of other atheists who have witnessed miracles and realized that they were wrong. Now, when I read personal testimonies on the internet, or reading anything on the internet, I usually take it all with a grain of salt. I mean, geez, if I believed everything that you read on the internet, I believe that on December 21st of this year, the Earth is going to explode. I believe that aliens are actually in control of the White House, and that somewhere in Colorado, there's a secret Stargate, and the Air Force actually made the movie just to throw us all off the trail. Well, the stories that float around are told and retold, and we hear urban legends about some guy that fills a car in his driveway full of cement only to find out it's a gift from his wife. And the stories are always, there was some guy or a woman that somebody knew. So when reading the internet, I have to cross-reference everything with multiple stories, just so I can ensure that it's true. Maybe it's just a geek in me that likes to research, but when I even read the news, I'll pull up Fox, the BBC, and CNN, so that I can look at the story on all three sites and cross-reference just so I can get a whole picture. Well, when reading the internet about atheist conversions, I found that there was a trend about how some of the people had converted and that they had near-death experiences. And I read their testimonies, but then I would read the atheist blogs that were underneath that. You know, kind of like Sun Tzu, Know Thy Enemy. And I found that there were some pretty interesting facts that they were always trying to debunk it. They said that it was something like the dying mind oozing endorphins to try and protect itself. And they had all sorts of explanations. But in all the blogs, I never saw anybody who actually had a miraculous experience happen in their lives and say that it was all just a load of bull. Nor did I ever read anybody say that they had a secular near-death experience. You know, where they die, they see the light, and they go. And on the other end, it's Charles Darwin who tells them, you know, in the world of natural selection, you just lost. There was one really interesting case that I read where I'd found a story about I'd found the story and found it in multiple independent sources and multiple testimonies about it. About a famous 20th century philosopher in England named Sir Alfred Freddie Ayre. An article said that Sir Alfred Ayre was a leading philosopher in England. He was an executive in MI6 during World War II, and he was well known for debating logic and naturalism and atheism on the BBC against Hugh Modifier, the Bishop of Birmingham, a Jesuit priest, Martin D'Arcy, and a Jesuit priest and biblical scholar, Frederick Coplestone. Well, in 1988, Sir Ayre was taken to Middlesex Hospital in London with pneumonia. Well, being the famous philosopher and being a professor, he had a lot of visitors that came in and brought him treats. And the staff used to turn a blind eye to all the treats and food that people brought into him. Well, one of the things that people brought into him was smoked salmon. And in the hospital, it was described that he had carelessly tossed a slice of salmon into his throat and choked on it. His heart had stopped and his mind was deprived of oxygen for 4 minutes. The hospital note simply stated cardiac arrest, bradycardia, and asystole. Karen explained to me all of those meant. Well, something else that I learned in Karen's medical books is that irreversible brain damage usually occurs at around the 4-minute point. Well, once the staff had arrived and had revived him, they began to make a neurological assessment, and Dr. Jeremy George, senior consultant for the Department of Thoracic Medicine at London University and Middlesex Hospital, was one of the physicians. And in an article, he said that in order to ascertain if Ayre had suffered brain damage, Professor Shapiro and senior consultant George had the subject Ayre do a general knowledge quiz to test his brain. I think we asked them who the Prime Minister was and what day it was, said George, and the answers always shot up. And they were all correct. He blew us out of the water. There was absolutely no brain damage. He was very lucid. I think he wanted us to ask more questions, such as the players of the winning football team of the First Division. And we had no idea if he was making them up or not, but we just assumed that they were all correct. That same day, having finished his rounds, Dr. George returned to Ayre's bedside. I came back to talk to him. Very discreetly, I asked him, as a philosopher, what was it like to have a near-death experience? He suddenly looked rather sheepish, and he said, I saw a divine being. I'm afraid I'm going to have to revise all my various books and opinions. Freddie was discharged from the hospital on the 3rd of April, or the 3rd of July, 1988, and he died a year later, having remarried Dee Wells, who was his second wife and then became his fourth. Despite declaring himself a born-again atheist, his friends and family noticed that Freddie, like 63 other patients who had been interviewed having near-death experiences at that hospital, certainly seemed to change. Freddie became much nicer after he had died, said Dee. He had not been nearly as boastful, and he took an interest in other people. Ayre also told the writer Edward St. Aubert in France that he had a kind of resurrection, and that for the first time in his life, he had begun to notice scenery. And in France, on a mountain near his villa, he said, I suddenly stopped and looked out at the sea and thought, my God, how beautiful it was. For 26 years, I had never realized and stopped and looked at before. What was also undeniably true, but was never really reported on, was that at the end of his life, Freddie spent more and more time with his former BBC debating opponent, the Jesuit priest and philosopher, Frederick Capelston, who was at Freddie's funeral in Golding Green Crematorium. They got closer and closer, and in the end, he was Freddie's closest friend, said Dee. It was quite extraordinary. As he got older, Freddie realized more and more that philosophy was just chasing its own tail. Well, in 1988, shortly before his death, Ayer wrote an article entitled "What I Saw When I Was Dead," describing his unusual near-death experience. And of the experience, Ayer first said, "It slightly weakened my conviction that my genuine death will be the end of me, though I continue to hope it will be." However, a few days later, he revised his words, saying, "I should have said that my experiences have weakened, not my belief in that there is no afterlife, but my inflexibility in the attitude towards belief." It was suggested by a lot of his friends that his stubbornness and pride in his life's work prevented him from ever saying more and admitting the truth. Well, it seems possible that atheists can have a change of heart, and that people can have a change of heart both ways. The stories of the atheists changing their heart come in a moment of divine intervention in their lives. There are also stories of the Christians who have slowly lost their faith over time. So far, the ones who lose their faith, how do we get them back? For some, coming back is like a flash with a miraculous intervention that removes all doubt in our lives that God is the one who is really in control of the universe. This reaffirms it. This gets reaffirmed in pop culture. You know, you see the burned out minister in some movie, and through some flash of divine intervention, he suddenly gets all of his faith back. However, lately those movies all seem to be about either an exorcism or fighting vampires. But anyhow, for most Christians, I think we go back to the sports analogy. You know, when the one team is being worn down by the opposition, and they just get tired, and they're so far down in the game that they just want to give up. Well, it reminds me of the old story about Knute Rockne giving the halftime speech to Notre Dame when they're being beaten so badly by the army and they have that great comeback. Well, if you don't remember who Knute Rockne is, he's the one with the famous quote, "Let's just get out there and win one more for the giver." That's the speech that inspired the team to go in and inspired the Ronald Reagan movie. Well, coaches everywhere hope that they can give those kind of speeches. I'm always teasing Matt that his opposing teams must always get those speeches at halftime because it seems like A&M will be up 30 or 40 points and only to be beaten after the halftime. Matt doesn't see anything like that. Well, anyhow, encouragement can go a long way in helping us reaffirm our faith. I think the analogy of what's written in your heart and really means what's written on your soul. We seem to be such fragile and fickle beings. You know, it's kind of like the photos that you have hanging in your hallway. After a while, the colors seem to fade, and they seem to be just a pale remnant of what they once were. I often have things in our lives that help darken and refresh those images, though. I find myself, when I'm reading the scriptures, see the pure genius in the words that are attributed to Jesus. I often find solace in the testimony of others, too. Testimony of the miraculous events that help darken the ink of what's written on my soul. When I hear firsthand accounts of what's happened to people, I know that it defies all logic and that it goes against everything that I've been taught in physics. And I know that there must be a master in control of the universe that darkens the ink that's written on my soul. My own personal experiences reassure me of what I hold to be true. They change what's written in sand to being carved in stone. You know, when I research, I cross-reference, and I find where things correlate everywhere. Something each of you has when you tell your testimony is unique. Because when you tell your testimony, you tell it in the first person. There is no cross-references. You're not talking about some guy I know or there's a woman that a friend of mine has. You tell it in the first person because it actually happened to you. That means something to other people. That means something to a lot of people. that reassures their faith. What is written on your soul? I know from talking to each one of you that your convictions keep what's written on your heart bright and permanent. Your testimonies have reaffirmed me more times than you know. Your testimonies have reaffirmed others so many more times than you know. How do you know that divine intervention hasn't brought you to a specific place or to a specific person for you to tell them, for you to be the one that refreshes the ink of the writing on your hearts? Please, continue to proudly show everybody what's written on your heart.
Amen.